Lynsey and I are really pleased to have been asked to come do this masterclass with you all. It's been a really interesting year, and the lack of, I guess, physical tastings. We've now sort of been accustomed to sort of these group tastings online and Zoom tastings, as it were, and sample packs and such. So it's been really really great to sort of have the community come together and log on and have the interest in what we do. So I'll let Lynsey do most of the introduction. She's much better presented than I am, and is a bit more cohesive. So I'll give it over to you, and you can take it away.
Great, setting all the expectations.
I mean, you kind of have to in this, right? So
yeah. Well, good evening. I mean, to give a bit of background on Blackbook, if you haven't come across us and our story before, so obviously we're a household, as you can see. We're in one place. We're a married couple, and we set up Blackbook Winery together 3 years ago now. We got it set up in April 2017. And without giving you the full history, the genesis is Sergio had started out as a som and then moved quickly into winemaking, realizing that he loved the industry, but to make wine. So he actually did technology education study. He studied at Blanc College in England, and spent his autumns and spring months in some cases traveling around the world in various harvests, rebuilding up experience in the wine space, particularly focusing on cool climate Pinot Chardonnay. Here I am just giving your background. So we
Should you start over?
No, it's fine. I've done it now. We went to New Zealand together in 2015, 2016, and we had our daughter 6 months old. So that gave me a chance to join Sergio on the harvest, and really got a chance to understand what it's like in my kids. I have a day-to-day corporate job, still do. So we came back to London and decided that we wanted to and ultimately decided that there was appetite in London to set up a winery here. It fit for us and our lifestyle, but it was a really great chance to bring winemaking to our little pocket of London and to create a resource both for consumers in the city, but also the huge wine trade in the city as well. And that's proved to be really successful. So in our 3 years since we've set up, we have, created a lot of opportunities for people to come and spend time with us and participate in harvest, come and taste wine, join one of our weekly tours and tastings. So in addition to producing the wine, which obviously is the core and the focus, it's been great to have that real experiential opportunity that we can offer to people in London. And we continue to be a family business, still very small but growing. And this year has been it's challenging years it has for most people in the industry, but because we are quite a small outfit, it's enabled us to have the flexibility. So I think we're content as to how we've got through and just completed the 2020 harvest, which Sergio will talk about in more detail. So pleased to be on the rundown to Christmas now.
That's quite good. And just to add to a few points, Lynsey, is that when we set out to create Blackbook, and we wanted to basically the whole ethos of what we do, and what we've always sort of set out to do was be sort of single vineyards, grower-led, focused, with the fact that we have all the vineyards. So what we haven't really touched upon is the fact that our business model is one that's such as referred to as a micro-négociant. So, and most of you will know what that is. Those of you that potentially don't, what that means is that we effectively have relationships with varied growers. We hand select all the people we work with, and we buy the fruit off them every year. And we have sort of long-term contracts. We have new growers. We have sort of now seemingly what's, I guess, referred to as old growers, or sort of the OGs, as it were, in terms of
you just make it up as you go along.
I just make it as you go along. But then we'll get into this a little bit further along the masterclass. But the really what we do is we work in a 2-hour radius. And that's enables us to have that relationship with our grower. because I go visit the vineyards multiple times a year, particularly lead up to harvest. And we have that sort of the symbiotic relationship. We, as a winemaker and as a winery versus a grower, there's always a tug of war in terms of what's going to be financially viable for the grower in terms of holding on to the fruit. And as a winemaker, we want to be able to hold on to that fruit as long as possible without sacrificing the quality. So that's kind of the general business model of what we work with.
But maybe to add, in addition to the proximity to the growers, a key focus for us is sustainability.
Yeah, very much so.
And we want to make sure that the product that we are producing is as sustainable as it can be, and appreciate that there's a couple of things in wine that tend to impact how sustainable a bottle can be. One is the glass itself and the production that goes into that, and the second is the mileage on getting the wine to the consumer. So glass, we are really working to get light bottles and recycled glass, and really focusing on sourcing the best product in terms of the packaging, without it diminishing the quality of the wine when it reaches you eventually. But also the proximity, the mileage means that we have, in theory, less miles on the wine by the time it reaches the consumer, compared to some others. And one of our earlier releases, we even had a wine that was from grapes grown in London at 40 Hall Vineyard. So that wine, we figured, had 19 miles on it at the point it left the winery, which is a good starting point for wine in respect to sustainability.
Yeah, so that is part of our core ethos. So just to sort of summarize, because we're kind of rambling a bit, but to summarize, that the purpose of what we do is really just to make good quality, high quality wines from growers sourced in 2 hours. And we focus on single vineyards, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and that is a core range, which will have all of the core ranges, the Pinot Noir, the Chardonnay, and the Pinot Noir Rosé, made from 2 different vineyards right next door to each other in Essex. And the other part is we have some experimental wines, which are effectively the mix-up in the GMF. Those are wines that we experiment with using different varieties, different methods, different processes to create that wine and different ambitions. And those wines kind of come in and out as we go. We first started in 2017, as Lynsey mentioned, after the harvest, and we will be trying one of our first inaugural wines, which is the GMF 2017, which we've just, as a winery, we've just sold out of, but Hallgarten has, I think, about 100 bottles left, so not a whole lot. But that's really what kicked off that sort of range. And we keep a separation between the two because we want to be focused on more or less having that consistency with the core range. And with the experimental range, things kind of come in and out. Now, sort of moving on from that, our first vintage, we worked with 2 growers, Clay Hill Vineyards, based in sort of the Crouch Valley, Essex, which we're hearing a lot about currently. And the second grower was Yew Tree Vineyard, based in Oxfordshire, which is where the GMF grapes come from, which are Seyval Blanc. And that first year, we aimed to create about 10,000 bottles. Unfortunately, due to a sort of early May frost, that was then reduced to about 6,500 across 4 different wines. Amongst those wines, as I said, were the core range, the Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Pinot Noir Rosé, and then the GMF. And so we've, as a business, we've always wanted to move on and create and grow. So moving on from 2017 vintage, which was sort of a bit of a reduced yield, smaller, and quite difficult on the whole in terms of a first vintage and starting a business. Now the 2018 vintage, we then sort of trebled production and went from 6,500 bottles to roughly about 18,000, 20,000 bottles roughly, going from 4 wines to, I think we made 8 wines that vintage. And then keeping on that trajectory, we've now stayed at about 20,000 bottles. Now, in terms of how we make the wine, given our background, given where I've worked, so as Lynsey sort of touched upon, my background was working, sort of starting at Plumpton College and then moving onwards to doing what is referred to as, I guess, being a cellar out, harvest and turn, or whatever it is. So I did 7 harvests before we started Blackbook. But mainly they're all sort of organic or biodynamically run vineyards and wineries that focused on cool plant Pinot Noir Chardonnay, but they did things in a more minimalistic manner, meaning that they don't necessarily add sulfur, they don't use yeast, it's indigenous fermentations, bacteria, etc. And so that's the approach that we've taken at Blackbook. And I'd sort of hesitate to say that we're natural. We are very much probably on more in the minimalistic intervention, meaning there's I guess the lines kind of skew together slightly, but I like to keep a slight separation with that. And I think the core difference is that we will intervene where we need to in order to create a quality wine that we find is going to be acceptable to our standards.
Yes, if all the conditions are perfect, you probably would make a natural wine.
Yeah. I mean, in 2018 and 2020, the wines didn't get any sulfur at pressing. We don't settle the juice. We sort of just let it ride, really. 2019 was a little more difficult vintage, so we ended up having to sort of interject a bit more with the fruit and be a bit more careful. So, the beauty about being an English winemaker or being a winemaker in Britain in general is that it's never a dull moment. Every vintage is different. Every way we do things is different. It's about sort of how do we mitigate those risks? How do we gain consistency in the wines? So that is sort of what I view as a sort of separation and definition of what we do.
There's probably a few key things. So all the wines are vegan. There's no fining in the wines and limited filtering, just where.
Yeah, I mean, and typically, in an average year, we only filter the rosé. So our intervention is kept to a sort of minimal basis, if that makes sense. Now, beyond sort of the fermentation aspects, all the wines get a minimum of 6 months. Most are between eight months to a year. We have some late releases that are getting 2 years plus. That will be out, and we have one that's just another Chardonnay that was released in last month, along with the 2019 Painter of Light, which we'll try today. And so we, as Lynsey mentioned, we don't necessarily filter or fine the wines. We sort of try to be as meticulous as we can with what we do. So I try to avoid cloudy wines and try to avoid sediments, albeit the mix-up volume 1 does have a bit of sediment in it, but I think that's actually benefited the wine a little bit. So that's kind of a crash course in what we do in terms of the winemaking and processing side of things. I guess we should probably talk about the 2020 vintage. It is a bit of a ride, I think, for most.
The COVID harvest.
The COVID harvest, the frost, the yields. I think 2020 harvest sums up 2020 in general. And Ben and myself and Jim and Colin, we were chatting earlier about not only 2020 harvest and vintage, but also about 2020 in general and how COVID's affected us. And I guess in terms of the harvest conditions, we've had a really good harvest. Like 2020 is going to go down as a super vintage, and the reason being is that we had some excellent weather at the right times. So it was one of the earliest bud bursts on records. So we had a really lovely warm spring, and then there's some troubles ahead in sort of May. Same thing in 2017. So luckily, most of our growers were not really affected by frost. Yew Tree Vineyard had a little bit, but it doesn't necessarily affect us, purely because the Seyval we get from him wasn't really touched. But those sort of Hampshire and north really got stuffed. So we had a very similar condition to 2017 in terms of the spring, but that followed by a really warm and beautiful summer until we got to about September. And so, you know, those who picked in early September for the sparkling varietals have done really well. As a still wine producer, I should probably emphasize that, you know, we are predominantly still wines. The GMF is the only bubbles we make, and that's really just for a bit of fun. And we make it in a more Col Fondo style, meaning that, you know, we don't disgorge it. It's traditional method, but it's lower lung pressure, etc. So, but the October was, you know, a mixed bag. We saw a bit of rain. We saw some really lovely warm weather. We saw some colder weather. So our harvest started on September 25th or 28th?
28th, I think.
September 28th, we got some Pinot Noir that came in, and we finished on, we got all the grapes in on the 21st. So it's a 4-week long harvest, and as I said, yields were low. So they're smaller berries, smaller bunchy, which is good for concentration from our perspective. Bad for growers because their yields were down pretty significantly. And as a business, our yields were down about 15% to 20%. So, you know, if we're only making 20,000 bottles, that's a significant chunk of our production. So it's a bit unfortunate, but I'd rather have lower yields and better quality fruit than getting a lot more fruit and having the quality be a bit poorer. So, you know, all in all, it was a great harvest, and it made winemaking quite easy in the winery. So we didn't have to intervene too much. I should probably actually sort of mention that a lot of what we do is sort of trying to bring out the varietal character in the wine, and distinguish not necessarily terroir per se, but a sense of place, which is why we make single vineyard wines, which is a bit more unusual. But also, majority of what we do is barrel ferment and aged. You know, our wines get between 10% and 40% new oak, all French oak, all mainly Burgundian oak, and we use 3 different coopers. So it's really important for us to have that diversity in sort of the cooperages, because they all have very distinct characters that come about, which is pretty integral for the style of wine that we make, which you'll be tasting throughout the latter part of this session, and you know, hopefully you'll find a synergy and a pattern with them, and that pattern being, we make sort of textural wines that have sort of a fuller mid palate and sort of have that length on the palate. And what's really interesting about the lineup that the Hall Gardens put together is that it's a combination of 3 vintages, 17, 18, 19. And whilst they're all not all the same wines, it gives you a good perspective of how things have gone within those 3 years. And 2020 will be, again, another notch within that vertical that will give a timestamp to what we've done. So I think that summarizes pretty well about what we do and how we do, and where we are. I guess the next thing is the future. What does the future hold? So the future of Blackbook, and is really sort of, we're looking to continue our growth, and for next year it's to continue to experiment. And you know, we have some amazing wines that we've done some really small batches with, to sort of look at innovation, look at what we can do, and sort of keeping on track with what we've done previously. And then that's more about collaborations. That's more about sort of putting together varietals that potentially were not previously sort of known in the UK. It's looking at longer term aging and all that fun stuff. So for 2021, we have some really exciting things to look forward to, and including increased production and looking at afar. So hopefully that gives you a bit of insights to where we've gone from 2017 to current. So do you have anything to add?
No, I think you covered it.
Great. Where are we for time?
Should we try some wine?
I think that's a really good idea. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but those of you that have the Pinot, please either decant it or pour it in your glass now. I probably should have mentioned this at the beginning. If I'd written a note on my hand, I would have reminded myself. But the reason being is that the Pinots have whole cluster, they have oak, they're young. Particularly 2018 is a big wine for what we do here. It also has a little bit of dissolved CO2, which helps sort of dissipate. But the wines themselves just need air. And I would almost argue that all the wines that we make, if you drink them young, should probably be decanted. You could use definitely 15 to 20 minutes at a minimum of air. So, but in terms of the pecking order, let's rock on with Mix It Volume 2. That's
to start with.
Let's start with, yeah, that's probably the leaner one. So that's this one here. Again, this is, as we said earlier, the experimental part of our range. Mix It Volume 2 is very different than Mix It Volume 1. This is the first year we've worked with this vineyard called Coombe Bottom, based in Horsham, Sussex. It's about 50 minutes away. I'm just going to put this on camera here, just so you guys understand. We basically, as I said, this is quite unusual for English or Welsh wineries, whereby where people who purchase fruits don't ever put the vineyard names on the bottles. I think we're the only ones that do it, as far as I'm aware. And the reason being is that the grape market is really competitive. It's a shame because.
Well, also I think it's just the standard. I think it's not.
Also, the thing is, people actually combine vineyards. So they don't necessarily. There's not a lot of people just get fruit from one single vineyard. And a lot of people, at least the larger growers, tend to blend several different vineyards together. And so what we try to do is we work with growers that are a little bit larger. And so we have the ability to make wine from a single vineyard capacity where it's not going to be like 300 bottles. So
it's the benefit of being small as well. I think that we can really focus on with a relatively small batch, being able to really highlight that particular site, that grape, that grower.
Yeah.
And I think the other reason that we talk about the growers on our bottle, and we try and talk about them as much when we're sharing our story, is that provenance is really important, and we totally appreciate that as consumers. You can't make that good grapes, and we want to really highlight and recognize the growers because they are critical to us having a product that we're proud of.
Yeah, for sure, and that's really what it is. For those of you that have Mix It Volume 1, it's a slightly bigger wine, slightly more aromatic. So we're going to get to it in 2 wines time. So we'll just to give you an idea of the orders that we start with the Mix It Volume 1 because it's a slightly leaner wine due to the vintage, and then we're going to go to the 2019 Chardonnay, and then we'll do the sort of 2017 GMF, followed by the Mix It Volume 1, and then we'll go on to the Rosé and the Pinots. And the reason for that is just because, it's I think you'll probably ruin your palate with the skin contact wine going back to something like the Mix It Volume 1. So as we mentioned, Coombe Bottom Vineyard, first harvest, first year we've worked with this winery. This vineyard rather. It's a blend of Chardonnay and Pinot Gris. And we ended up basically having a 50-50 split with it. And with that in mind, we ended up having both fermented in 500-liter barrels. So second and third fill. And this had about 8 months of aging. All the wines that we make go through full malolactic. It's a big thing what we do. Adds a bit of character, the complexity from my stance, but also English wines just need to have that lower acidity. It's not always possible to have the ideal conditions to pick where the acids are lower. And through mallow, it's a way to deacidify the wine naturally. Excuse me. So this, for me, has one of our calling cards, and that's reduction. That sort of gunflint, smoky aspect is a big thing with what we do, and that's really from my time working in Burgundy, and it's just something I love the character of the wine. It's having a little bit of reductive character just brings some lift to the wine, brings a bit of sort of this smokiness and this sort of immense sort of flintiness to it, beyond, I guess, what is considered inherently minerality, in conjunction with that. So, the nose, you got these bits of honeydew melon, this waxy lemon aspect, and some almost like bitter lime as well. And for me, that's really a lot of Pinot Gris on the nose. And on the palate, again, this is what I'm talking about. So for those of you that do have a mix of volume 2, again, texture, it's quite taut. The acid is definitely prevalent. And this is a wine that could use a lot more aging to it. But it's also a wine that can be drunk now. And it's a really interesting thing to see in terms of, from my perspective as a winemaker, from how the fruit came in, where it sat post fermentation, where it sat after élevage on gros lees, where it sat once we rack it out. So this wine didn't get any. No, I lied. This wine got a little bit of sulfur at pressing, but through aging, we just kept the barrels topped up, which is one of the main things we do. And then to when we rack it in the tank, sulfur it and put it into bottle. And seeing it sort of 3-4 months on, I love seeing that evolution. I love seeing that process. And it's wines that I like. And I don't know why. Just kind of do. I think it's just there's a lot of pressure, and I end up having a big freak out.
I think it's less issue than before. I think it's just getting into the zone of being.
You reckon?
Ultimately responsible. Yeah.
Getting into the zone of screwed up.
Yeah.
I think this year's just easier. It's when you have good quality fruit and you have a good vintage, it just makes life easy. You don't have those freakouts. You don't have to worry about it. The one thing that I always do worry about is under ripeness. That's a big issue in the UK, and that's something that we really sort of struggle with is sort of controlling yields and controlling ripeness. And the way I approach it, is I don't. So looking at numbers and looking at picking dates and things like that, and this is where I go back to what I originally said in terms of the sort of external battle between grower versus winemaker, is that most of the growers that I've worked with in this country historically have picked on what's referred to numbers. So looking at sugar levels, looking at acids, and it's like, all right, potential alcohols 11%. Acids are at 9 grams a liter, we're going to take it off. And as a winemaker, I go through the vineyards and I taste all the fruit before, the weeks leading up to it. And I do harvest sampling, which is not uncommon. But I pick on flavor ripeness or more sort of referred to as phenolic ripeness. And that's looking at the pips. Are the pips still green? Looking at the stems, are the stems lignified on the actual on the grape bunches. How does the skin taste? How does the pulp taste? Does it taste green? Are there in red wines any of that sort of bell pepper sort of under ripeness? Do the seeds taste nutty? So these are the actions and the process which by I like to pick at. And once the fruit tastes correct is when I like to pick. And that's not always possible due to weather, climatic conditions, or logistics, or whatever it is. It's also about sort of logistically working in with what's going to work with the picking team, what's going to work with the grower as well. So hopefully we find a sort of a balance there.
And that's what you call phenolic ripeness, right?
Flavor ripeness,
which is hard to measure, and that's one of the challenges. You can't sort of put a target with a grower and say, at this level we pick, and you can do that for some of the other metrics. So that's why having these relationships that Sergio is really investing in building over time helps get to a point where he can really, have that really positive dialogue ongoing with the growers.
This is our 2019 Painter of Light. This is kind of what put us on the map from 2017. Good idea. So in 2017, we got a couple tons of Chardonnay from Clay Hill Vineyards. Clay Hill was one of the only vineyards to sort of, sign on board with us without even knowing who we are. Imagine this, starting a new business, coming into an environment and an industry where no one knows you. I didn't have the luxury of, anyone knowing who the hell I was. I was just some kid. I don't know. No, I was an adult. I was some guy. That's much better at, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. But I was effectively an unknown coming into an industry. Yeah, I knew people, but I didn't spend my sort of years at Plumpton, only working in the UK, getting to know the industry and sort of working my way through that. Yes, I worked for a number of UK wineries and vineyards, but that wasn't my focal point. My focal point during that time of learning was to go learn with other people and find the best ways of doing so. And as a result, my UK network was quite, it's quite small. So trying to utilize those network utilize that network rather, proved quite difficult. And so a lot of it was based around cold calling, and I geek out to data. I'm not very good at data, but I geek out to it. And a lot of it was looking at climatic conditions and rainfall and find out where these vineyards were and if they're going to be suitable for us. Clay Hill Vineyard turned out to be immensely suitable. And after a long few months of calling people, knocking on people's doors, driving around, following my pins on Google Maps, getting doors slammed on me, getting phone calls hung up by, and Clay Hill's just like, yeah, on board, sure. So he really came on board, and he provided us with the fruit that we've continued to work with him for the past 4 years. And as a result of the fruit that he gave us in that first vintage, the Chardonnay has been the most recognizable wine that we've made, I guess, that year and arguably to date, more so with the trade and with wine critics. And so we've really lucked out and haven't had sort of the ability. So generally how we make this wine is, oh, by the way, Clay Hills, as the name suggests, on clay soils in the Crouch Valley vineyards, due south facing, very sort of minimal slope. this is a single Burgundian clone, 277, if you want to geek out on that stuff. The vineyard's about 16 years old, started in, about 14 years old, starting about 2005, 2006.
The clonal selection is important though, and
for me, yeah,
it's probably something to mention if people aren't familiar. Chardonnay is obviously one of the most planted varieties in England, and that's because you'll know that we are famous for our sparkling wine industry. Traditionally, Champagne has 3 grapes: Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier. So where the English producers were really focused on creating a sparkling wine that's, following that standard, those have been, heavily planted grapes here as well. And where you'll sometimes have English Chardonnays that are still wines, they may be using a clone of Chardonnay, which was intended for sparkling wine, because it has a higher acidity. So by getting the Burgundian clones, like the one that Sergio referenced we get from Clayhill, the acidity is generally a little bit lower, which works better for a still wine. So the clone of the grape, in addition to the grape itself, has been a really important part as we've been building those grower relationships and building the foundations for the wines.
Thanks. Yeah, very true. I mean, it's difficult. I say it's difficult as a still wine producer to try and find vineyards that, are geared towards that. As Lynsey mentioned, it's a significant amount of our UK production is sparkling wine, approximately 70% to be precise. I think it was like 67%.
But it's shifting, right? I mean, the
It's
wine
shifting,
industry is growing really quickly in England, and it's really diversifying, and there's a lot of great producers doing exciting things. So it's definitely one to watch.
For sure. And we saw that in 2018. We see that again more in 2020 as well. People are getting on board with that, and it's due to a number of different factors, but primarily sort of global warming, which is the worst and the best at the same time for us. So Clayhill Chardonnay 2019, Painter of Lights. This was whole bunch pressed. The Chardonnay, typically most of their whites are whole bunch pressed unless it's gone to skin contact or unless there's diseased fruits. We a whole bunch pressed straight to barrel. We don't settle. Solids are a big part of what we do. Desires and wants within what you want for an end goal it's quite difficult because the fruit doesn't always cooperate. But our intention with this is to use oak as a attribute to give lift to the wine. So our Chardonnay from this site is normally, we normally use between 20 and 30% of new oak. Varied size. Most of our new oak barrels are either 500 liter or 300 liter barrels. I learned a lot about sort of the barrel regiments through these different places. So it's really key. You can have 50% new oak as long as you're able to marry that into the wine and understand the different forests and different toastings. So barrel fermented, aged in barrel for the entire time, high mass salads, and then this wine gets about a year of barrel age, full malolactic, batonnage, you do a lot of lees stirring, and then we bottle it unfiltered and fine. So the 2019 was bottled in August, released in October. That's going backwards.
Nothing was released in April. That
Nothing
was part
released
of
in
our COVID impact. We normally have 2 releases a year. This year we just had a single release in October of 5-6 months. I forget.
So this, for me, it's very quintessential Chardonnay characters, and what I mean by that is you get a lot of that sort of ripe melon. You get some integration from the reductive characters, a little bit of the flintiness. You have some attributes of the oak, some of that's a little bit of coconut and vanilla, but also a bit of cinnamon, and a little bit of pineapple as well in the background there. Whether or not you guys get it or not, it's just story. And this is the beauty about wine. It's all preferential. On the palate, again, more of that sort of oak tannin, a bit more lemon though on the palate, like juicy, zesty lemon, bit of salinity. And again, you get that length, and 2019, as we discussed, was just a wet and cold vintage. So it's, it's a little bit taut, but again, these wines are meant for longer term aging. And so it sort of helps out with acid, alcohol, tannin, or all sort of attributes that you want in a wine that's going to have longer aging potential. So I'm conscious that we're running out of time, and so let's crack through.
What's next?
We're going to go to GMF.
Here's one I opened earlier.
So kind.
But I'm still Chardonnay.
So GMF again was this is 2017 was a inaugural vintage, and this is really what kicked off our experimental range. So when the Seyval Blanc came in, I had no idea what I was going to do with it, none whatsoever. So it's the issue that we face is I had no idea what we're going to do. So it's typically looked at for me. This started off as a still wine, and that was primarily because I had no intention of making sparkling wine in our sort of in our endeavors. But after about 6 months of aging, this just tasted so good that sparkling wine base that I wanted to build up. I also didn't want to keep it in the serious sparkling wine. That's all. This is a serious wine. It's just the thing about it is that it's there's bacteria, full malolactic, gross lees, and then after 7 months, we blended everything together and we bubbled it up. But we didn't go full 6 bars you would per normal. We ended up actually going more about 2.5 to 3 bar, and that was purposely done to sort of make it more like a prosecco style wine. And again, you on your bottle, you might have a white wine thrown on the bottom, and we were meant to disgorge this. I did disgorgement trials after about 7 months, and just found that the wine lost a bit of its character, even on longer term aging, which I kept some wine behind for another 6 months. Again, we didn't really see the fact that there's a benefit of disgorging it. So hence you have sediment in the bottle itself and it's a bit cloudy. But instead we found that the degradation of those lees within the bottle, to no surprise, had the same effect as you would for longer term aging of a traditional method sparkling wine that would be normally sort of a little bit classier. But the benefit of having that in there is that we get a lot more of the autolytic character. So this wine took about a year to come around. It also took took a lot of people by surprise, because you do have that texture there, and that the acidity softened up quite a bit. So it's now been in bottle for almost 2.5 years, and the past 10 months has come into its own. And this has been my favorite wine that we've made recently. Not that we made recently, my favorite wine recently, since it sort of like turned this corner last July.
I love this wine.
Do you?
I think it's just delicious and really drinkable, and it does so well with food. It does well independently. So, and it has really continued to evolve. So
yeah, it's pretty delicious.
It's in great shape really well now, which is good. Then we've had a question through around what GMF stands for, and I think what we can say about that is it's named after a song. The song is called GMF. The song lyrics have, they'll tell you what they stand for. But maybe just talk a little bit for a minute about our labels and the way that we name the wines, because people often comment on that as well. So, you'll notice with our Chardonnay or our Pinot, we have this sort of series of what we call our Londoner faces, and each one is trying to represent a bit about the city. So our Chardonnay represents art. It's called Painter of Light, which is Turner's nickname, and has a so for us, it's a bit of music in London again. London is the transport. So this is generally the most recognizable one for anyone that has been used to being on the tube. So it's represents
so a lot of inspiration comes from Victoria Line.
yeah.
It's not necessarily a bad thing, but so going back to the GMF, as Lynsey mentioned, this is the first time we've done this. First time it's an experimental because I've never made sparkling wine before in this capacity. You see, it's changed a bit as well. It's getting a little more sort of like savory tropical, which is quite nice. And the palate for me, it's waxy lemon all day long, along with that autolyte character. But there's a real salinity to this. For me, like from day one, this wine has always shown this like really salty character on the back palate, which I really like. Mix up volume 1, right? Mix up volume 1. We worked with Red Hill Farm Estates this for just one vintage, 2018. And the Mix Up Volume 1 is a blend of, like the Mix Up Volume 2, it's a 50-50 split, but not Chardonnay and Pinot Gris. This is effectively Bacchus, which is 50% and fermented, whole bunch pressed, straight fermentation, steel tank, no bells and whistles, gross lees. And then 50% Ortega fermented on skins for 30 days. The Ortega is then pressed off and then aged in barrel. Aged in barrel. And sorry, we're trying to navigate our Wi-Fi at the moment. Aged in barrel, 20% new oak. And it got 6 months of aging, and again, no filter refining. And this is a wine that's definitely been full of trials and tribulations. And it's a wine that I liked, that I didn't like, and I've come to like again. And it's what's really nice about this is that our intentions were not sort of geared towards making an orange wine. We really just wanted to make a skin contact wine that added texture and depth. Hence, there was a bit of sort of 50-50 split. So what we have here is the Ortega is bringing a lot of this pithy mandarin, orange peel, papaya, guava, and then the Bacchus gives you this real elderflower notes, and then brings a bit of herbaceousness, sage, thyme, sort of on the back of that. And for me, it marries up quite nicely having those two, because you get savory and an aromatic. But beyond that combination, the intentions of this wine were really to make an aromatic, I guess, for lack of a better word, full body, medium bodied, and textural wine that was low in alcohol. So it's only 10.5%. In fact, it's a little bit less than, it's like 10.3, 10.4. You have a lot going on. It's not just this like aromatic blast and then this sort of linear palate. It's quite broad and gives you length and it gives you texture. And a lot of what we're doing, so typically, in terms of food pairings like that, a lot of it is really just being shellfish and seafood. But this actually goes really well with a lot of different types of food. I mean, typically English wines are not really geared towards anything beyond that has a lot of sort of spiciness or bold flavors. However, this wine in particular, because you have that structure behind it, and you have this sort of aromatic profile, and that those aromatics continue on the palate, has a lot more diverse application in terms of gastronomic science. And so with that, this goes well with puddings. It goes well with sort of more meatier dishes. Also, very typically, you have this with maybe scallops and black pudding as a very typical British dish. So, that's sort of the preference of this wine. That is the antithesis of what we're trying to create. And the mix-up in general is just that the blend is changing every year until we find something that we like, and we'll hold on to that. But until that happens, we're going to continue to experiment with different varieties.
And this one's evolved a lot as well. It's changed a lot, I'd say, since it was released 18 months ago now.
Oh.
So if you've tried it in the past, be potentially quite different now. For me, it's getting a lot creamier and richer as it ages as well.
I mean, I hated this wine for the first 6 months to 8 months after we bottled it. It just closed down. It was austere. It was weird. And then it just came back around. And I really like it now. I think there's a fun application. 2018 Rosé. Again, another wine that took 8 months to come around. But I'm really pleased with it. The Rosé, the backstory to that was an accident. Never intended on making a Rosé. The first year we made this wine is 2017.
We were always going to make a Rosé.
I was never intending on making a Rosé. No. Well, maybe in your heads, you're making a Rosé. And so with that, long story short is the fact that our tanks arrived after the fruit came in by 2 days. So fortunately enough, I bought extra barrels and knocked the heads off some barrels. And we ended up sort of fermenting a ton of Pinot Noir in these barrels. And then we had over 1 ton of Pinot Noir left, with no place to go except for the press. And that's how Rosé came out. And it's the first wine we released. Is one of the most successful wines we've made. And as a result, we've continued on that path, albeit the iterations of the Rosé has changed from year to year based on the vintage. 2018, we used a different clone. This is a Germanic Pinot clone, and we destemmed most of it. Maybe a small proportion was left whole cluster. Did a 8-hour cold soak, and then pressed it off, 100% barrel fermented, and then we aged 25% in steel tank. Again, this is the only wine that we really filter consistently year on year, and it's purely for aesthetics. People get a bit funny about cloudy rosés, but for me, this is a rosé that ages. This is 5, 6, 7 years, and you get a lot of strawberry cream. You get a lot of this sort of like ripe cherry aspect, loads of confected fruit notes, with this underlying savory sort of point to it.
It also does really well with food, and we did a really interesting pairing with this a few weeks ago with a chef, Elena Emmett, who was cooking a dish with a lot of tamarind in it. So, you know, even with really spicy foods, you know, it can hold up really well and be a good compliment.
Sorry, I'm just gonna get these. Yeah, this is definitely a food that you can have with like heavier dishes, without a doubt. And because you get this creaminess and you have the textures, it goes well with spicy foods. You know, and it's again, you know, this can be drunk on its own or with food. And you know, if you have a cheese and meat platter like a charcuterie, like that's to be honest, it's kind of like my dream afternoon is drinking wine with cheese and meat. It's pretty brilliant. Right, so moving on, we have the two Pinots left. We have a 2018 and 2019, and it's really interesting. I've actually never tried these side by sides, and if you have both of these, that's just doing the same, because they're very different wines. Why the Germanic Pinot clone for the Rosé? Yeah, it's just Germanic clones are an interesting one. I don't like them for still Pinot Noir reds. I find that they're a bit green. They tend to have these really sort of austere notes. They tend to hold acidity, and they just don't ripen as well as Burgundian clones or French clones for that matter. But for Rosé, they're shit hot. They're really good because they bring a lot of that spiciness, the structure, and the color extraction that you don't get the same extraction off these sort of more delicate clones. And as a result, now the Rosé is a Germanic clone, and it's something that I've really enjoyed because it brings a lot of body and depth to the wine itself. The issue about green character is that the longer you sort of let it sit on skins, the longer you extract from those skins and those flavors, the more likely it is you're going to get those green notes. So yeah, that's why. But our Pinots,
they look exactly
the same, except we're modern. We're QR coding it.
I really need to make that QR code link properly.
Yeah, fail. So let's rock with the if you're able to have them side by sides, please have them side by sides. It's really interesting. They're made effectively the same way, and how we make that is we destem most of it about between 60 to 70%. The Pinot Noir gets destemmed, but there's always between 30 and 40% whole cluster, and there's normally about 10%, about 10% new oak in it, and it just allows us to bring forward. And hopefully, you're getting an idea of the wine styles that we make. It's it's all about texture, it's all about breadth, it's all about sort of longevity in the wines. This is 2018. So 2018 Pinot Noir, again, touching upon the 2018 vintage, as we've had a lot of.
19.
Yeah, you were it's really good. I mean, 2018 was hailed as a iconic and sort of game-changing vintage. The yields were big, ideal sort of Indian summer. And so which allowed us to ripen the fruit and give it hang time and allow it to have a bit of sort of breathing room.
Very similar colors, aren't they?
A bit. I mean, if you're given, can I see that? Then the 18, I think, is marginally darker, but marginally. So we, as a result, we kicked up the whole cluster. So this is about 40% whole cluster. We aged this for a year, no filtering funny on this. We ferment in sort of large stainless steel and some Dulab bins, and we give it a little bit of post maceration extension, really. So for this is a really savory, real savory wine. There's a whole lot of sappiness coming off this. from the whole cluster, loads of sour cherry, licorice, cassis, you know, almost like a dried raspberry aspect, and a bit of smokiness as well. Wow.
It's tasting really good.
Softened up quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the structure's there, the whole cluster's there. I mean, I have, you know, obviously I don't necessarily drink our wine that much, to be honest. And typically when we drink our wines, it's normally in a tasting setting with trade customers or consumer events. But because those have all been bagged for the past 9 months, we've I haven't really tucked into much of this, but this has evolved quite a lot.
Yeah.
It's softened, it's sort of getting a bit more tertiary, and it's sitting in a really good place. I'm quite liking this. So yeah, so on the palate again, you get more smokiness, you get the tannic structure from the whole cluster, from the new oak, and you end up getting a lot more sort of what you smell on the palate, and that's very nice. So we've had a question about what is challenging about making Filipino or England. And will we ever get close to Burgundy in terms of quality? Most challenging is, I think, is just getting the sites. I mean, at a very basic level, it's finding growers that are like-minded and planting good clones. That's really the most challenging thing. I know you're probably referring to more climatically, like what's the most challenging thing, but you know, we made Pinot Noir every year since we started, amongst other reds as well. And the most challenging thing that I face is really down to sort of site selection and clonal selection and grower attitudes. That is more challenging than climatic conditions. If you have the right site with the right grower, the right clones, you're laughing. And that's really ultimately sort of what it is. Now, in terms of making world-class wines similar to Burgundy, I think it's quite a difficult thing. It's in terms of having a comparison of two different sites. In terms of quality, absolutely. I don't see why not. In terms of style, I think it's very much about maintaining that sense of place. So England is renowned for acidity for good or bad, but acid is king. Like, that is what it gives us our identity here. It's managing that acidity. It's managing those profiles of how you do it. But of course, you then have other factors like vintage, like the winemaker's stamp, what they do, how they do things. So, but there's no doubt we can make world-class wines. I think that's quite prevalent, and that we're seeing that more and more in stills as the years go by. And look, we're a young company, we're a young winery, and we're young to the game. So, you know, that's just after 4 years of making wine in this country.
We've had another comment about the Pinot. It benefits from, the 18 has benefited from being open for a couple of hours, and you mentioned at the beginning,
Totally.
you know, it's good to decant it. Do you think that it's the same for the 19?
Yeah, particularly if you're drinking it now, yeah. I mean, as I said from the start, all our wines need decanting. All our wines need something to sort of to air. You know, unbeknownst to me when we started this venture, and how we make wines at Blackbook, how I make wines, is that unintentionally I've made wines for longevity and aging, so they don't necessarily show well within their first year. And that's a really challenging part about it, but that's also really exciting because you then have this immense excitement about this aging potential about the wine, and all the wines that we've made, including the Pinot, and I guess most certainly the Pinot, I think in this respect, have surprised me after a year and a half in bottle. And it's made me smile to understand that we have that ability to make wines that have ageability. And that's really sort of what is amongst the most exciting and challenging and nerve-wracking part of what we do. So hopefully that's answered that question. Now, in terms of sort of the most challenging thing about the 2020 vintage, I think it's just the yields, man. The absolute yields and you know, we're so down on yields, and it's just really disappointing. But beyond that physical sort of, you know, that physical factor, challenging for us was sort of balancing phenolic ripeness and dialing the rain. So trying to pick fruit in before the rain came in, having fruit not necessarily be ready before the rain came in, and sort of looking at that part. So that's trying to manage. Oh man, yeah, the last 2.5 weeks of October, we had like 2 or 3 nice sunny days, pissed down for like 1 or 2 days. Then we had to wait for the grapes to dry out. Then it pissed down again during that process. It was just trying to logistically figure out when the best time was to pick, and we got it right. I'd say 90% of the time. There are a couple, 1 or 2 parcels that I think we probably should have picked maybe a few days earlier, but c'est la vie.
We had another question earlier on about with Brexit and people drinking more English wine, but struggling with the pricing. Is there potential for Seyval to take on a leading role? And I guess the question is possibly in regard to Seyval as a sparkling. And what's been really interesting for me is we've launched
really well.
As we've launched, you know, the wines. People's familiarity with the varietal has really helped with some of the wines get traction and have people try them. So the Pinot Noir and the Chardonnay is an easier sell because people recognize those varieties. Something like a Seyval is less familiar. People, although because it sounds like a Sauvignon Blanc, they often just assume it's similar. There's definitely a challenge with the unknown or the less familiar grape varieties, and how do you tackle that? But absolutely, it's a great grape, and it does really well in this climate. And
it's a grape. I mean, it's like it's like the poor man's Chardonnay. You know,
yeah.
It has a lot of very similar characteristics. Chardonnay. It handles wood really well. Upstate New York, I tell us. So we do. Well, we were doing weekly tours and events, but and this is something I often say on those occasions, that we typically in upstate New York, it's really sort of viewed as poor Chardonnay because those names are still ripening it quite well. But it's, I mean, on a final note with that, it's highly underrated. You know, Breaky Bottom does some really great stuff with it, and you know, given the conditions, I'd love to make a still wine out of it. So, you know, for me, it's a wine that will continue to work with. I mean, the grower. I mean, this is, if you treat vineyard, his name's Ed Mitchum. If I can have 10 of him based around various parts of the country and these ideal sites, I would be the happiest winemaker in the world. He's just epic, and he gets it. So,
and that's what we mean about the exciting part of where the English industry is. You know, and if anyone's interested to learn more, Oz Clarke recently published a great book, which is a lovely summary and overview of where the English wine industry is today. Lots of great stats and information. It's beautiful. It's very visual. Nice Christmas present. We're not on commission, I promise. We just really think it's a great book. We are in there.
We just love Oz. Oz is great.
He is. He's great. He's a great champion for English wine, and that's been great as well in the industry. You know, there's been a lot of support from the wine critics, the wine trade, which are, you know, they're very, very UK centric, but you know, historically they've, you know, obviously, well, they continue to cover all wines of the world, but you know, they really are supporting the English industry and getting behind it and helping to give profile, which has been great and much appreciated, and we look forward to it continuing. Yeah, I mean, with that being said, we're horribly over. Sorry that we overran. We're about 7 minutes. 12. Seven. We started.
I've enjoyed every moment of it.
This is what happens when you get an American and Scot rambling about wine and you know, English wine history. So
it's been brilliant to hear you talk so passionately about it. Thank you very much, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. And thank you everybody for watching. Cheers, guys. Bye.
Thanks. Bye all.
Thanks a lot, Ben.